Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Glenda Abbott. I'm from Saskatchewan, a place called Pelican Lake First Nation. And I have the beautiful honor of introducing one of my teachers and someone I respect, Wes and his wife, Joanne. We'll land with Wes. You know that it's just, you need to be ready and open to receive all of the beautiful teachings that he has that just flows out of him and comes out really natural. And we've just had so many opportunities to learn and to grow with him in our understanding of buffalo ecology. And I'm so grateful that he's so willing and open and very generous with his knowledge to share with so many people. You always leave feeling so full and good and just generous energy with him and his wife. I also had the pleasure of hiking with his wife to see some buffalo in Banff National Park. And I love her and him together as a team. The artistry that comes out of her photographs and actually Wes has surprised me with how amazing he is as an artist with wood and as a builder and just with art in general. So I'm so grateful that everyone here on this call gets to receive some of his teachings and listen to him today. So thank you for allowing me to introduce him, and thank you, Wes, for being here today. And thank you, Adrian and Melissa and Teresa for hosting and bringing all this together.
Yeah, now that I've heard all that, I can log off and go and get a bigger hat size. So thanks everybody for logging on and participating in this Zoom presentation. As she mentioned, it's 2024 will now be my 40th year working with bison across Western Canada, Alaska, Siberia, and into the northern US states as well. So a long history of working with these animals. And I decided some time ago that I wanted to be able to give back what I know to the bison community, folks like yourselves. So I created this PowerPoint presentation. It's based upon our new book, The Ecological Buffalo, on the Trail of a Keystone Species. And it takes the viewer through what it's like to live on a landscape with bison and how they interact with the other species that they share space and time with. As she so nicely mentioned, this is my wife. Without her photography, I would just be a talking head. So she really deserves credit for the work that she does in her role as a conservation photographer. We'll start off with the historical distribution of North American plains and wood bison, who they share those landscapes with, and how they affect those ecosystems. This is a young bull in Yellowstone National Park crossing the Lamar River in Yellowstone. We'll talk about who they share the landscapes with and some of the species influenced directly or indirectly by bison on the landscape. This is a map that was put together by Joel Allen in 1876, and it simply shows the contraction of the historic range of plains bison. Each of these colors represents a decrease in range size through the decades up to and including 1885, when there were only 23 wild free-ranging bison left in all of North America. And they were hiding in the upper Pelican River Valley in Yellowstone. At the same time, in northern Alberta, there was about 250 wood bison living in and around what's now Wood Buffalo National Park. And this is a complex map that you don't need to pay a lot of attention to, other than these folks organized 116 different ecoregions in North America. And this is a map of each of those. And I went through each of them trying to find out whether or not plains bison lived in them, and found at least 46 ecoregions occupied by plains bison. Some examples of these are, as I just mentioned, Wood Buffalo National Park, a group of young bulls on the salt plains in Wood Buffalo. In 1963, a small herd was captured. 18 animals were captured from Wood Buffalo National Park and moved to the northwest to establish the Mackenzie Bison Sanctuary. This is an old bull from that region. This is Antelope Island State Park in Utah, a very arid, dry landscape. And coincidentally, across the lake from this photograph and a little bit further to the right is a place called Promontory Butte. Promontory Butte has several caves on it that have been lived in continuously for over 6,000 years by native peoples. In the back of those caves, they found a large midden, a garbage heap of leather. And when they investigated those leather scraps, they found out that they were moccasin soles primarily, created out of bison leather. But the upper parts of the moccasins were exactly the same as the Dene peoples created, and that's evidence that the Dene people moved south through Canada into Utah and gave rise to the local people that live there now. They made it into the upper panhandle of Texas. This is Caprock Canyon State Park. one of the last free-ranging bison populations to be captured by Charles Goodnight under the direction of his wife, Mary. This is an isolated population, a remnant of the southern herds. They made it into the oak savannas of Florida, down the panhandle a little ways, but not too far. In the tallgrass prairie, this is in Oklahoma at Tallgrass Prairie Preserve. The tallgrass prairie, for those who haven't been there, is called that because the big blue stem grows upwards of 2 meters in height. Very productive landscape, and it extends up into southern Manitoba. The mixed grass prairie of South Dakota, this is on the 777 Bison Ranch, where they run several thousand head on a massive short and mixed grass prairie ecosystem. They made it into the Rockies, just the southern end of it, in the Grand Tetons National Park. And of course, they made it into the aspen parklands of Saskatchewan and Alberta. This is Prince Albert National Park. But the majority of the talk is going to focus on the northern mixed grass prairie of Grasslands National Park, where my wife and I spent 10 years prior to retirement. I took this herd there in the spring of 2006. 71 animals were released onto that landscape that hadn't had bison on it for well over 140 years. So it's fun to see those animals adapt and acclimate to that landscape. For those who haven't been there, the arrow points to Grasslands National Park, and to my cursor, this is the Cypress Hills, an unglaciated remnant from the end of the Pleistocene. The Frenchman River Valley flows southeastwards from there. This is the sort of the white line of it flowing into the Missouri. And that's where the bulk of the talk will focus. So this is a classic example of Grasslands National Park. The Frenchman River Valley flows behind this butte. It's an incredibly complex landscape. At the end of the Pleistocene, this is one of the few places in North America where the Laurentide or the continental ice sheets collided with the Cordilleran ice sheets that moved east from the Rockies. They met and collided right here. North of the Frenchman River, the Laurentide ice sheet retreated and melted northwards, leaving behind long linear meltwater channels that go for miles. South of the river, in the foreground of this photograph, the Cordilleran ice sheets melted in place. They just dropped straight down, leaving behind an incredibly complex and diverse landscape. And because of that complexity, all of these different aspects and slopes and the water that forms in the bottoms of these draws provided an excellent landscape for bison to colonize. They should just back up. On top of some of these buttes, like this central one, you can often find upwards of 200 teepee rings, and some of those have been dated back to 6,000 years. It's a long human use, of course, as well. So how do bison impact the ecosystems that they live in? Here's a pair of brown-headed cowbirds warming their feet on the forehead of this young bull. But they do it in three principal ways. They do it through direct physical disturbance on the landscape. This bull is having a piddle and fertilizing the vegetation that somebody else will come along and eat later on. They create winter trails. And this is a really significant introduction back into this ecosystem, because when Grasslands National Park was first formed in the late 80s, park policy at the time dictated that all cattle would be removed from the landscape as they acquired new ranches. Then that landscape sat empty of large herbivores like bison from 1987 until they were returned in the spring of 2006. So those winter trails no longer existed on the landscape. And that had a huge impact on other species like pronghorn antelope, for example, which I'll get into more. Bison obviously have a pretty direct disturbance by dropping dung pats on the landscape. This one was speckled with the droppings of a robin while she stood on it and listening for her prey. Bison wallows, of course, are a pretty significant disturbance, and we'll talk more about those. But bison create patch grazing, little intensely grazed patches within the taller vegetation. And this is one of the driving forces behind bison ecology over the last 130,000 years of their existence in North America. These little patches are what drove bison migration patterns, their whole ecology. And pugging, it's just a fancy word for a footprint, but a really significant direct impact on the landscape. And of course, the urine. So here's an example of what the landscape might once have looked like with those massive trails driven through the deep snowpack. This is actually a cattle ranch in southern Alberta, but this is what it would have looked like with bison back on the landscape historically. Horning and rubbing of trees and shrubs is a really significant disturbance. These folks theorized that it was the removal of both bison from the aspen parkland and the reduction in native burning that caused the aspen parkland to expand both southwards and westwards. And that's had a huge impact for species like the northern spotted owl along the rainforests of Western Canada and the US, because it allowed the barred owl to move from the eastern hardwood forests through the aspen parkland and eventually over to the west coast, where they're now out competing the spotted owl for habitat. Some of the more direct relationships, Wood Buffalo National Park is the only place on the continent where there was never a disconnect between wood bison and wolves, and of course the ravens that followed along behind the wolves looking for food. We were in Yellowstone a few years ago and saw this boar grizzly on a freshly killed bison cow. He foraged on her for most of the afternoon. We came back the next day and there was a sow grizzly with 3 yearling cubs on her. And by the end of the day, they had her completely cleaned up, leaving just behind a skeleton like this. And carcasses on the landscape are a hugely important nutrient pulse into the ecosystem. When you think of there were perhaps 30 million bison in North America, plains bison, each with an annual mortality rate somewhere between 2 and 3%, that's thousands of carcasses on the landscape. This is in Elk Island National Park. This bull was killed by another bull during the breeding season. The park put a trail camera on it and counted 18 different coyotes visiting that carcass over its lifespan on the forest floor, and dozens of different bird species. And those coyotes, of course, leave droppings behind. This is a coyote dropping that's created entirely out of bison meat, and they provide food for, in this case, the satyr common butterfly. They're puddling on it, searching for the phosphorus and other nutrients that they need. This is a sexton beetle. It's called a sexton beetle because the sexton of the church is responsible for burying the dead, and that's what this guy does. They have a tremendous ability to detect a carcass on the landscape, whether that's a mouse or a bison. Those carcasses give off a column of inorganic compounds. I like to visualize it like a campfire giving off a column of smoke, which we can see from long distances. These guys can detect a carcass using that same analogy. So they'll fly to the carcass, hop off, grab a meal of bison meat buried in the soil as a food source for their eggs and larvae. But this one's carrying a load of phoretic mites, little wee tiny guys that are not much bigger than the head of a pin. They can't navigate from one carcass to another on their own, so they hitchhike from carcass to carcass on a sexton beetle, hopping off and doing their reproductive process as they go. Some of the more indirect relationships, I mentioned facilitative grazing, the ability of bison to create landscapes that are ideal for other herbivores, species like white-tailed deer, nuttles or mountain cottontail, mule deer, pronghorn antelope, black-tailed prairie dogs, and white-tailed jackrabbits. I'll get into each of those in more detail as we go along. And some of the broader food web relationships. In Grasslands National Park, they've identified at least 77 different grasshopper species. That's likely increased as the surveys continue. And grasshoppers provide a huge foundational prey source for all the insectivores that live on that landscape, including microteins like the western jumping mouse, swift fox, red fox, and coyotes, squirrels, of course. This is a horned lark nest. She created her nest in the bottom of a bison footprint that was driven deep into the clay, wove her nest out of bison hair that she'd picked up off of the landscape, and then laid 2 of her own eggs in there. And then along came a brown-headed cowbird that parasitized the nest with 2 of her eggs and abandoned the rearing of those to the lark. So completely functioning ecosystem just in one bison footprint. And shed hair we'll talk about quite a bit more as we go along. This is the second warmest fiber, native fiber in all of North America, next only to the muskox and kiviot. And this whole functioning ecosystem and that diversity is all because of the way bison graze the landscape. This is what the landscape in Grasslands National Park looks like now. As I mentioned, we started with 71 animals. The park now maintains a core population of about 600 animals, which they reduced every 2 years down to perhaps 350 or 400, with the surplus going to establishing other conservation herds to public auction and with priority towards establishing new herds on First Nations lands. They share the landscape with a wide variety of species, including 26 birds that are considered endemic grassland birds. This is the horned lark that I mentioned earlier. 9 of these can only be found in diverse grasslands like Grasslands National Park. And of these 9 species, are considered to be obligate grassland birds, species that you won't find in a forested environment, for example. And these are them. Each of these species across their historic range is in a state of population decline. Some of them are severely threatened on their way to extinction in some areas, or extirpation certainly. And we'll talk more about some of these as we go along. There's also 35 mammal species in Grasslands National Park. This is a black-tailed prairie dog colony there. But a dozen of these are obligate grassland species. Here's some of those. We'll talk more in particular about the northern pocket gopher and the black-footed ferret and prairie dogs. The grasshopper mouse is a really unique little guy. He's a true predator. They don't hunt or don't forage on seeds and vegetation like other mice do. They're truly a predator of grassland insects. And they have this unique ability to, on a full moon night, if you're out on the grassland and it's calm, you can hear these guys howling like a tiny coyote on the landscape, where they sit up on their haunches and howl at the moon. I tried to get Joanne to go closer, get a better picture of this prairie rattlesnake, but that's the best she could do. Actually, I got hecked for forcing her to go that close, but this was safe with a long lens. There's obligate reptiles and amphibians, of course, and these are some of them. We'll talk more about the toads as we go along. Both the plains garter snake and the yellow-bellied racer use the burrow systems of the northern pocket gopher in their reproductive cycle. The greater shorthorn lizard is a tiny little cryptic lizard, not much bigger than the end of your thumb. And unless you disturb them, you'll never see one on that landscape. They're so cryptic. How do they influence the other species they share space and time with? Well, this is a young bull that's wallowing, and that's a pretty significant disturbance that other species actually benefit from. As bison are grazing across that landscape, their noses are constantly embedded in the vegetation that they're eating. This is a pair of brown-headed cowbirds picking up insects that are disturbed by that bison as they graze. All of this leads to enhanced habitat for other wildlife species like these pronghorns. But how does all this happen? It all begins with bison snot, or buffalo snot. We were in Hermosa, South Dakota, and popped into a little pub, and there, lo and behold, was this on-tap beer called buffalo snot. It's a delicious beer, by the way, if you're ever down that way. But it's the elixir that drives that entire ecosystem. Without bison snot on the landscape, these species couldn't survive out there, nor could any other four-chambered ruminant. As they're grazing, their noses are constantly embedded in the landscape. And as they graze, they're inhaling. They have the largest lung capacity of any North American land mammal. And they're ingesting and inhaling those microbes. And they in turn get stuck in the nasal vestibules in the front of the nostrils. And over time, they have to clean that gunk out of there. So they lift their heads up and quickly flick both nostrils clean. And in doing that, they're swallowing and ingesting the bacteria, fungi, and other microbes that are in the vegetation. And that's critical for their survival, because these microbes are the ones that break down the fibrous vegetation that the bison digests. And in some cases, it's been estimated that up to a quarter of the protein that a bison consumes in a day comes from the digestion of these microbes themselves, not from the vegetation. So once they've ingested it, where does it go? Well, it pops into the rumen. I had the opportunity just recently to measure the volume of a bison rumen, and it was 44 gallons of partially digested vegetative material. So as the bison swallows those microbes, the fungi break down the starches so bacteria can digest it. The bacteria in turn break down the sugars and protein and fiber in the vegetation, and they in turn are hunted by protozoa. So within the rumen is a completely functioning ecosystem of predators and prey, and they all are designed to help the bison digest the food that they've consumed. This is a microscopic slide of a protozoa. I like to think of these guys as the equivalent to a great blue whale swimming through the ocean, feeding on krill or phytoplankton, the similar scale of size. There are literally millions of these guys in the digestive system of a bison, and then each of these contains millions of other microbes. And of course, what goes in must come out, and it lands on a landscape in a very photogenic buffalo patty like this one, which in turn contains a whole functioning ecosystem of predators and prey and a wide variety of species. The first to colonize it are the fungi, bacteria, and protozoa that survived the transition through the buffalo. And they're almost instantly hunted by a whole suite of other insects, fungivorous beetles, dung-feeding beetles, diet flies, etc., who in turn are all preyed on then by a wide range of different predatory insects. This is a species of dung beetle, Photius fimitarius. Not sure how they figured this out, but I read a paper that said that they arrived in North America with a shipload of cattle from Britain in the Boston Harbor in about 1896. And now they're one of the most common dung beetles on the North American landscape. These guys can detect a fresh dung pad on the landscape, much like that analogy of the campfire, from long distances away. They'll fly to it through an aerobic rich environment, splat head first into an anaerobic environment, where they quickly then have to create these burrow systems to the surface to allow air to get inside that buffalo pat. They don't actually eat the dung pat, they eat the microbes that have arrived with it. There's lots of historical records of bison patties, fresh ones during the summer, disappearing completely from the landscape in just a few days due to the burrowing and digestive patterns of the insects that colonized it. So to help people understand that, the 3 functioning groups of dung beetles on the landscape, I created this illustration to show that that little red guy, Aphodeus fimentarius, is a dweller. The female will land on the landscape, burrow into it, create a chamber, then in that chamber, create brood balls. Each of these brood balls she'll lay 1 egg in, and then when that egg hatches, the larvae feed on it, mature, and eventually disperse. So that's a dweller. The rollers are the ones we often think of, those dung beetles that roll a brood ball of dung across and away from the landscape, or away from the dung pad, across on the landscape. And these are the only insects on the planet that use celestial navigation in their reproductive cycle. On a full moon night, these female dung beetles will roll their brood balls towards the full moon. And if there isn't a full moon, they use the Milky Way as a guide to help disperse their brood balls away from the dung pad. And then there's the tunnelers. There's fast burrowing and slow burrowing dung beetles. They'll go down, depending on the soil type, upwards of 1 meter, or in some cases deeper, creating these tunnels that go down into an individual chamber where, like the others, the female will create a brood ball, lay 1 egg in it, and then the larvae develops down there. There's a variety of different species of fast burrowing and slow burrowing dung beetles, and they each have slightly different ecologies. But the really important part of these beetles on the landscape is their ability to bring both rainwater, surface water down deep into the fibrous roots of the grasses, and the dung that they bring down there with them to enrich the soil where it's most needed by these grassland plants. And then they, in turn, of course, are hunted by species like the long-billed curlew or the McCown's longspur. Really quite a fascinating ecosystem just on that 1 dung pat. This is a pair of dung beetles, the Canthon pilularis, on a bison ranch in southern Alberta. One female has created a brood ball with an egg in it, and the other one is trying to wrestle it away from her. They fought over that for some time, and eventually the winner rolled this dung ball across the landscape and buried it in the vegetation. There's been some studies that show that 1 buffalo pat can, just in itself, host up to 100 invertebrate species. And of those 100 species, up to 1,000 individual insects will benefit from that 1 dung pat. There's some work that suggests that a bison cow can, just from her own dung, produce 1/4 of her body mass in insects every summer. So that's a tremendous quantity of insects on the landscape, especially when you think of 30 million bison roaming the North American Great Plains. So I tried to figure out what that would be like. And I took William Hornaday's graph of population decline from 1861 to 1889. This graph represents how quickly North American plains bison were extirpated from the continent. And based on 1/4 of body mass of an average animal, I extrapolated that back up to the number of insects. So this graph actually shows the number of insects in the billions, 300 billion at their peak, roughly. Imagine how desperate life was for insectivores on the landscape in 1889 when all of those insects vanished from the landscape. It must have been horrendous. So how do bison affect grasslands ecosystems? Well, they do it in a variety of ways. Every time we establish a new bison population, especially if it's a free-ranging wild population, the receiving agencies want those animals to arrive as late in the winter as possible to reduce the time spent feeding them. That can be a very labor-intensive and difficult task on a remote location. So during the winter months, the bison will create these grazing lawns, little wee patches where they forage through the snow, cratering as they go to get to the vegetation that's inside these grazing patches, and they vary tremendously in size based upon the vegetation that the bison is consuming. Here's what that looks like in the spring. This is a grazing patch within the surrounding taller untouched vegetation community. And this is the place that greens up first. That's that same vegetation patch in the spring, surrounded by ungrazed vegetation. And this succulent new vegetation that grows repeatedly is what drove bison ecology for thousands and thousands of years. Because as they move across the landscape and they graze these patches, they crop it right down close to the ground. And then just like us, when we have to mow our lawn, we'll cut it on Monday, and Wednesday we've got to have to cut it again. The vegetation that grows back here is instantly digestible, highly nutritious, and this is what everybody seeks. And that continues through the growing season until about early to mid-August, when these prairie grasses begin to cure. And it's the abundance of these mixed grass grazing lawns that allowed those massive congregations of plains bison that we read in the historical literature, because they were able to sustain high densities of large numbers of animals for a brief, perhaps a 1 month long period in midsummer. There's accounts when the Canada-US border was being surveyed of a survey crew south of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, who were trapped in their tents for a continuous 10-day period while one herd of bison moved past them. They even had to bring their horses into the tents to keep them from drifting off with the bison. All of that was because of the way the bison grazed the landscape. And this is what grasslands looks like now after 20 years of having bison back on that landscape. Each of these tonal variations in the vegetation represents the complexity of that grassland system now. At the end of that 20-year vacancy, this was all one uniform monoculture of grasses, but it's changed significantly since then. Some of the examples of interspecies relationships, here's two that are non-native, European starlings, and the bison are bedded in a stand of crested wheatgrass. Crested wheatgrass was imported to Canada during the 1930s by the Canadian government as a soil stabilizing plant to put an end to the dirty 30s Dust Bowl era. And it did an excellent job of that. It's an average quality spring forage for cattle and average quality hay if it's cut at the right time, but it's also very invasive. In grasslands, there's an active program to eliminate crested wheatgrass and replace it with native species. To try to help folks understand what that landscape looked like prior to the arrival of the bison, I created this drawing showing how diverse the grassland ecosystem is. Lots of different grass species here, blue grama grass, needle and thread, wheatgrasses, a diverse grassland system, and lots of grassland fibrous roots under the soil. This probably stores more carbon than the Amazonian rainforests, and it's all done because these plants have the ability to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and bury it deep in the soil. But these are very fibrous roots. There's no tap roots on that system. When you bring bison back to the landscape and they graze those grazing lawns, the plants can't sustain that length of intensive grazing for a long period of time. And eventually that opens up the landscape for the invasion of forbs, flowering plants. This one on the left, for instance, is the winter fat. It's called winter fat because cattle actually gain fat on it during the winter months. It can sustain a 22% crude protein right through the winter and spring, where these other grasses will drop down to 8 to 10% crude protein. So over time, as the bison graze those landscapes, it opens up the grasslands for more species like this snuddled cottontail, and it allows for a greater diversity of taprooted plants. Over time, the complexity of the below ground vegetation roots changes dramatically. And eventually you end up with a really complex landscape of forbs and grasses, insects, species like the 13 land ground squirrels and butterflies, bees, you name it. This is a really diverse and complex landscape. And this now represents what grasslands has become with the bison back on that grassland. I mentioned earlier the northern pocket gopher. These guys create underground burrow systems like this where they travel horizontally. There's one research paper that suggested that it takes 3,500 times as much energy to travel 1 meter underground as it does 1 meter above ground. And they can't do that on grassroots. They need to have those thick, fibrous, taprooted plants. In addition to that, they create habitats for a whole host of species. This is just a very tiny portion of the list of species that have been identified using these underground burrow systems created by the northern pocket gopher. Most agriculturalists think of these guys as a pest, and they don't want them there. But in a conservation landscape, they're incredibly important. This was a neat study that I stumbled across where biologists in the desert Southwest states went to different museums looking for pickled snakes, pickled rattlesnakes in particular, because they wanted to dissect them and try to determine what these snakes were eating. And it turns out to be a fascinating story because Here in Grasslands National Park, we put radio collars on cows like this so we could follow them around and figure out what landscapes they were using, how far they traveled during the course of a day. And in this case, she's grazing, just for example, the western side of the park, and she's consuming the seeds as well as the leaves and other vegetative material. So those seeds enter her digestive tract. She'll maybe walk 10 miles in the course of that day or 16 kilometers, and then the group will bed down, regurgitate, chew their cud, and like all good ruminants, stand up and drop a buffalo patty on the landscape. That buffalo patty, or this dung pat, is full of the seeds that she digested along that, or meanderings through the park through the course of that day. And of course, then along comes the dung beetles again, forming these brood balls that also contain the seeds that were in that dung pat. And as they're buried in the landscape, those seeds germinate in this rich medium and produce seedlings, which are then grazed perhaps by a species like the Ord's kangaroo rat. This is the Indian rice grass in the background. Kangaroo rats and pocket mice have fur-lined cheek pouches where they can store a tremendous number of very fine seeds. They're cache foragers, so they'll go out there, fill their pouches with seeds, bring it back to a central food cache, which will be their food for the winter months. So as these guys are hopping across the prairie and they get attacked by a snake, the snake is also digesting the vegetation, the seeds that the pocket mouse has in its digestive system. Work has shown that these rattlesnakes can consume between 12 and 20 pocket mice in the course of a summer. And across a wide range, these guys travel tremendous distances in a grassland ecosystem. And as it's digesting these mice, they're traveling across the landscape, defecating like all animals do. But it turns out these snakes don't have the ability to digest vegetative matter. They can only digest muscle and tissue from the prey that they've consumed. So as the seeds are traveling down the digestive tract of the snake, they actually are germinating in the colon. And out as the snake slithers across the landscape are these fully germinated seeds in a rich medium that it speckles on across the landscape as it travels from point A to point B. And perhaps several kilometers away, those seeds then will germinate, produce new seedlings, which are consumed by an animal like the pronghorn, for example, miles and miles away from where the original seeds were captured by that bison in the morning. The introduction of shed bison hair to the ecosystem is another huge ecosystem service that bison provide to the species they share space and time with, and it snags on everything that they walk past. As I mentioned, it's the second warmest natural fiber in North America, and the species that bison share space with have learned that that's actually the case. Everywhere that Joanna and I go, we search for bird nests. This is in Prince Albert National Park, a chickadee nest, and the chickadee has lined the grassland nest in the bottom with the underfur of a bison, and then the darker guard hairs on top of it makes a phenomenal nest lining material. And every species that lives in habitats with bison, including many sensitive species, benefit from having that fiber in their nests. There's been some studies showing that there can be up to a 60% increase in chick survival when the nests are lined with bison hair, not only because of its warmth, but it also has an amazing ability to hide the smell of a grassland ground nesting bird's nest from the passing noses of badgers and coyotes and whatnot. The smell of the hair is strong enough to make it difficult for the predator to detect. It's also incredibly moisture resistant. So you get those heavy, wet spring snowstorms where a conventional nest might fail because of the moisture, and the cold bird nests lined with bison hair can survive under conditions that would kill other. Joanna was in a remote part of Grasslands National Park, and an area that the bison had only just recently colonized. Even after 10 years, they're still exploring new habitats there. In this case, she saw this Richardson ground squirrel scurrying back and forth from her natal den into a wallow where a bull had wallowed and rubbed off some bison hair. This animal in particular certainly had never seen a bison before. It's 140 years since the last one walked this landscape. You can tell that she's nursing. She's got a litter in her natal den, but somehow she intrinsically knew the value of this fiber to the young that she's trying to raise. And she made countless trips back and forth, bringing virtually all the bison hair that had been shed down into her natal den. That will also hide the smell of her pups in the den from the passing noses of predatory snakes like the rattlesnake, for example. Bison wallows create some pretty unique landscapes. Joanna and I like to think of these as the guest book of prairie society, Everybody who comes to visit them leaves their signatures behind for us to investigate. This is in Prince Albert National Park. A black bear and a wolf in one, bison wallow, coyotes in another, lots of different insects and birds using these dry or even wet buffalo wallows. It's incredibly important, and it was historically for thousands of years, when these clay-bottomed bison wallows flood in the spring and create these vernal wetlands. In the background, all of these brighter green depressions are ancient bison wallows that were formed hundreds or perhaps even thousands of years ago, and then maintained while the big herds roamed this landscape. But these vegetated ancient wallows don't hold water. The vegetation quickly consumes what water lands in them. But the clay-based ones hold water for a short period of time, depending on rainfall and snow conditions, perhaps up to 10 days. And that's critically important for species like the spade-footed toad, Great Plains toad. These species evolved on the open Great Plains and required these vernal wetlands in the spring for their laying their eggs and producing their tadpoles. This is the tadpole of the spade-footed toad. He's got eyes that face directly out to the sides, like most prey species do, and he's foraging on the aquatic algae and whatnot in that pond. But over time, as the pond shrinks in depth, it also increases in temperature. It warms up. And that temperature switch causes the skull of the toad tadpole to change. And the eyes begin to face forward like the adults. And they switch from being a herbivore to being a predator and begin hunting other aquatic insects that are in that flooded wallow. They have the shortest metamorphosis of any amphibian or reptile on the landscape, 10 days from egg laying to fully morphed adult, hopping back out across the ecosystem. So again, you imagine the millions and millions of flooded bison wallows that were on the landscape during the pre-slaughter era, and how that would have supported millions or perhaps even billions of toads and frogs. How devastating it was for those species when those wallows infilled with vegetation and could no longer support them. This is a scene I saw one day in grasslands early in the spring, and it was a miserable day, on and off sleet and snow and rain and patches of sunlight and a really nasty, cold, howling wind. I saw these two pronghorn does bedded at the base of a slope, so I stopped to just take a photograph. And as I watched them, I realized that the one in the center had just given birth to twins. There's two baby pronghorns in the bottom. Here they are. It took them about 15 minutes to get to their feet, stagger and fall a few times. And then she took them and the other doe around the corner of the slope and out of my sight. So I walked over to where she had just given birth, and it turned out to be an ancient bison wallow. It was maybe 30 centimeters deep. I laid down in the bottom of it where she had just given birth. Placenta was there, and I had to avoid the amniotic fluids. But I laid down on my back, and there wasn't a breath of wind. It flowed right over top of that wallow, and I was undisturbed by it. She herself was probably born in an ancient bison wallow, and these young fawns will likely do the same at some point. Bison prairie dogs have had a very long relationship. They're codependent. Prairie dogs can't live on a landscape with tall vegetation, so they actively maintain a boundary to their towns. If anybody's had the chance to visit a prairie dog town, they're really visible on the landscape because of the way the prairie dogs keep the grass cropped very short as a way of detecting predators and escaping down into the burrow systems. A lot of producers, bison or cattle producers entering this landscape, originally thought that because the grass was grazed so short, there's no value to their cattle to it. So there's a systematic eradication of prairie dogs across North America. There's records of colonies in the US, in Wyoming. One was 100 miles wide and 150 miles long, populated by literally billions of prairie dogs. The US Geological Survey had a policy in the 1920s and 30s of eradicating prairie dogs to create better habitat for cattle. And they literally destroyed billions of these animals. But in reality, the vegetation that grows inside these prairie dog towns, while it's short, is also incredibly nutritious, instantly digestible, and bison love it. So when they come to graze on here, they also forage along the edges, and they push that tall barrier of tall grasses back, allowing the prairie dog town to expand into that newly created habitat. Really quite a nice relationship. Prairie dogs have been in North America for more than 4 million years, bison approximately 135,000 years. And over that 135,000 years, they've become co-adapted to each other. Black-footed ferrets arrived in North America somewhere between 75 and 125,000 years ago, and they're a specialized predator that only hunts, or historically only hunted, black-tailed prairie dogs. Grasslands National Park introduced, I think it was 71 ferrets to the park over several seasons in the hopes that they would survive and recolonize this landscape. But they didn't. They all died from a variety of reasons, but probably the number one was in the bottom of these prairie dog burrow systems in their natal dens lives a flea, and that flea carries a disease called sylvatic plague. Sylvatic plague is exactly the same as bubonic plague, the Black Death that wiped out Europe on 3 different occasions, and it's uniformly fatal to ferrets. So all of the ferrets that were reintroduced to this landscape succumbed to it, or to predation by owls or traffic accidents, that sort of thing. Burrowing owls have a long relationship with both prairie dogs and bison. Here's 3 baby prairie dogs that are up from their natal den. The male burrowing owls overwinter in Central and South America, Mexico, and it's the male that flies back first. And he'll arrive at a prairie dog town like this, fly around looking for and finding abandoned or unoccupied prairie dog burrow system. Then he'll go across the landscape, picking up dried buffalo chips, bringing them back and decorating the top of this burrow system with broken up bison patties. Then the female flies back 2 or 3 weeks after the arrival of the males, and she'll fly around the colony looking to see who might be the best mate for her that year. And she does that partially by who's done the best job of decorating the burrow entrance. Once she's picked a mate, she'll go down into the natal den and lay her eggs and rear her chicks. The male doesn't stop there. He'll continue to go out and bring back more bison dung, continues to decorate the surface of the burrow system to attract beetles, ground beetles in particular. Then he'll break up that dung and take it down into the burrow system, right down to the natal den. And those beetles that have occupied the above ground portion begin to follow those trail of dung down into the den. And once the chicks hatch, they have the ability to learn to hunt beetles, which is their main prey in the spring, within the security of the natal den and the burrow systems. And really quite a remarkable relationship. This is a mountain plover standing on a dried buffalo patty. They're incredibly cryptic when they're on their nests. They're a grassland bird that you won't find anywhere else. And they're in a state of population decline across their historic range. They require heavily grazed shortgrass landscapes to hunt insects and create their nests. And this is what the nest looks like. It's simply a dried up buffalo patty fragmented into chips with her eggs. And if you don't see her flush from the nest, you would never find this. It's so cryptic that it's just invisible on the landscape. Sage grouse and sharp-tailed grouse, of course, are residents of the Great Plains, and both of them require short grass or even denuded vegetation for their lekking behaviors. This is where they'll congregate in the spring to do their breeding, and then females will disperse and create their own nests elsewhere. Joanna and I watched 3 different pairs of badgers and coyotes hunting cooperatively together in grasslands. It's a really unique thing to watch 2 apex predators hunting cooperatively, actively trying to support the other one in their day-to-day search for prey. These underground burrow systems of the pocket gophers prairie dogs are pretty unique structures. There's 2 types of mounds that they create. This is a rimmed mound. It's quite a bit taller. It stands up on the landscape very visibly. That's them in the background, these tall mounds of vegetation. And then there's domed mounds. These ones are very shallow and form a low dome, unlike that volcano shape. And as the wind flows across the prairie, it enters the domed mound and comes up through the rimmed mound, the taller one. And you can imagine, I know I've done it, walking down the back alley behind a bakery as they're producing fresh bread, how attractive that scent is when it comes out. And that's exactly the same as what these guys are searching for. So as the warm scent of prairie dogs emerges from the mound, badgers and coyotes are actively sniffing for and detecting it. So in this case, the badger has detected that there's somebody home, and he'll rapidly start digging in here. And the coyote will then dash over, because they're connected underground, and pop up or snag the prairie dog when he pops his head out of the hole. And then they'll reverse roles, and the coyote will meander his way through the prairie dog town, nonchalantly ignoring every prairie dog that's barking at it, and attracting their attention, intentionally attracting the attention of every above ground prairie dog. Meanwhile, sneaking in upwind is the badger. and picking off the ones that are focused on the coyotes. Really remarkable relationship. Here in the Aspen Parkland, this is in Elk Island National Park. This scene is actually just a mile from where my wife and I now live. It's a pretty typical scene in the early spring. This is what we'll see here in another couple of weeks. The park is a mixture of wetlands like this with cattails, open beaver ponds and lakes, and then these south-facing slopes that green up first in the spring. And bulls like this one have foraged through the day on these open grassland slopes, but they move back to the forest edge in the shade where they bed down, chew their cud, and of course leave behind a nice bison paddy. There's a higher density of bison paddies adjacent to the forest edge than there is out in the meadow systems because of that behavior of moving into the shade to ruminate. I was in the park one time years ago when I saw this young woman crawling around on her hands and knees in the middle of a large meadow system, intensely focused, like her nose was 3 inches from the ground on sometimes as she crawled along slowly through the grass. I couldn't stand it anymore, so I had to go over and ask her what she was up to. Turns out she was a PhD student from a university in Finland, and she was studying the slave-making behavior of one ant species on another. So she'd find an anthill, say a red ant. She'd follow a red ant as it left that colony. They would go to a black ant colony, snag a slave, and take that slave back to serve the host colony. And in doing that work, she discovered that virtually every anthill in grasslands, or in Elk Island, is built upon a bison paddy because the queens that are establishing new colonies seek out the nutrients that are contained in that bison pad. And because there's a higher density of anthills or bison paddies next to the forest, consequently anthills next to the forest, that's hugely important for these guys, the northern flicker, a medium-sized woodpecker that lives in these aspen forests. These guys create their nesting cavities fairly close to the edge of the forest stand. Then they hop out on the grassland hunting for insects and ants in particular in this system. And that's really important for these guys, the northern flying squirrel. These guys are fussy about the cavities that they use. And it turns out that the flicker cavity is the Goldilocks of cavities for these guys. Smaller woodpeckers create a cavity that's too small, and the pileated woodpeckers too big. So these guys are fussy, and they predominantly use northern flicker cavities. And they're fussy how they use them. They have some that are just for their refugia, places where they will go to escape a passing goshawk, for example, or an owl during the night. And they have others that they use just for rearing their young. And they have others that they use for their toilet, a place where they go to poop. And hidden in that flying squirrel dung is this guy. This is I can't pronounce the name of the dung beetle, but it's the tiny one, 4 to 11 millimeters in size, that's dependent entirely on flying squirrel dung. You won't find this out on a grassland, for example. So while it's not a charismatic megafauna, it certainly is part of the ecosystem, and it couldn't survive there without that linkage of bison on the landscape and their dung, and then the insects, the flickers, and then the flying squirrel poop. So quite a neat linkage of relationships. And then you think to what that landscape was like in the 1890s after the extirpation of bison across the historic range. And this painting by Frederick Werner is a classic scene to me that would describe the desolation and poverty of that landscape after having been so rich for so many of thousands of years. That led me to investigate this paper. These guys use the analogy of a DC-3 aircraft like this flying through the air, and there's some idiot crawling around inside of it, removing components, and some of which might eventually become critical. Eventually, the idiot will snag some part that causes the plane to crash, and it can no longer fly. And this is the DC-3 and a listing of all of the components that make that airplane a functioning ecosystem. And over time, as those pieces are removed, it can't fly. And this is a plane locally known as Miss Piggy, just outside Churchill, Manitoba. She didn't fly because of a missing critical component, but because she was overloaded, much the same way that we overload the ecosystems that we live within. So she was overloaded and couldn't sustain flight and crashed. The same thing happens in ecosystems. If you remove bison, in this case, the keystone species that provides the core of the functioning of that ecosystem, and you bring it back, all of those other functioning components of that ecosystem will eventually return, either on their own or with human intervention. So it's a pretty nice analogy. And then when you think of this map and how complex the landscape was, with those 46 ecoregions inhabited by bison, and we only talked about this one little speck of Grasslands National Park in the middle, imagine what life in North America was like before the bison were extirpated. I give this presentation fairly frequently to bison producer groups at conferences and seminars, and invariably a producer will hold up his hand and ask, I've only got 40 acres and I've got 12 bison on it. Is there any way that I can contribute to bison conservation or ecosystem conservation, or am I just fooling myself in believing that I can? And I tell every one of them that it doesn't matter whether you've got 6 or 10 or 1,000 bison, you're supporting the continental ecosystem, and in particular, the migration of migratory songbirds that might winter in South America or Central America and breed in Canada's Arctic or over even in Siberia. Sometimes they'll fly. Every one of those bison properties, no matter how big or how small, provides the insects that those insectivores need in their migration northwards. Stopover points where they can land, refuel, and then take off and land and refuel, hopscotching their way north up the Central Great Plains to their winter breeding areas, spring breeding areas. So every bison population, regardless of size, benefits or contributes to ecosystem diversity. As I mentioned, the talk is based upon our new book, The Ecological Role of Buffalo in the Landscape. And I've reached a point where I'll happily entertain any of the questions that the audience might have. This is a painting that I did after participating in the bison relocation into the backcountry of Banff National Park in 2017. I was there prior to the arrival of the bison with a Blackfoot elder, Leroy Little Bear. Leroy was walking around like a little kid in a candy store, just running from one spot to the next. He was 80-something years old at that point. I was a backcountry warden here through my career as park warden. I'd ridden into this region on numerous occasions, and I sat on this rock, tied my horse to a tree next to it, never paid any attention to it. Then Leroy came running over with his cell phone camera and said, Wes, look at this. It's a bison. And from his perspective, there it was. This was a bedded bison cast in stone. So I created this painting with this ghostly bison rubbing on it, saying, wake up, sleeping buffalo. It's time you returned. So I'll answer any questions now.
Thank you, Wes. That was so beautiful. I learned so much every time I hear this presentation. And as I go about, rebuilding my own relationship with buffalo or bison, I think deeper and deeper and deeper every single time that I'm out on the land and pay attention a little bit more. There is a question here. Let me just see. So it says, you have visited many bison herds over the course of the years. Have you ever noticed or observed how different the herds use different landscapes?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, the landscapes can vary so much from one ecosystem to another. Most of that time that I just presented was in Grasslands National Park, which is a gently rolling to riverine type landscape. And the bison will use that landscape differently than the ones that we put into Banff National Park. They're in a valley system called the Panther Red Deer Valley System. And they were held in containment for 2 years while they calved twice on that in a holding pen. After their second calving season, they were released and they're now free ranging in Banff. And they're utilizing landscapes that were formerly or still are occupied by bighorn sheep and goats. They follow the green wave from the valley bottoms to the mountain peaks over the course of the summer. So tremendous differences in habitat would create differences in grazing ecology. We did a translocation or participated in one into central Alaska using C-130 Hercules to transport 130 bison into a very remote landscape that's a boreal forest environment, thousands and thousands of square miles of wet sedge meadows and boreal forest. And they're utilizing that landscape completely different than the previous two that I just mentioned.
Wow, so interesting. Does anyone have any other questions?
I'll just briefly mention, I had the opportunity to participate in a translocation of wood bison from Canada into central Siberia. We were approached in the early 1990s by a Russian biologist, Sergei Zimov, and an American counterpart, Mimi Chapin from the University of Alaska. They wanted the Canadian government to provide bison free of charge to a project that he was initiating. He was trying to establish Pleistocene National Park under the theory that the seed bank that's in the soil at the end of the Pleistocene, 10,000, 11,000 years ago, was still there, and that it was the action of large hoofed mammals that maintained that landscape as a dry Mongolian or grassland type environment. With their extirpation, the landscape switched into a permafrost boreal forest environment. And his theory was that if you put the bison back there, they could return that landscape to its former vegetation community. This is during the Soviet Union era, and Canada said, no, we'll provide you with the bison, but you'll have to fund the entire cost. The Russian government had no interest in doing that. But following perestroika, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the market economy developed very rapidly, and the world's largest diamond mine owner stepped up and said, he's Russian, we'll pay for everything. I'll provide my own personal massive cargo plane if Canada provides the bison. So Elk Island National Park shipped 4 shipments of 30 bison in the belly of this Russian cargo plane into central Siberia, where they've formed a baby factory, and periodically surplus animals are taken from that baby factory reserve and introduced into Pleistocene National Park, along with camels and horses and European bison, a whole suite of large ungulates. And he's proven that it works. That landscape now is converting back to something that will one day resemble perhaps Grasslands National Park. So there are tremendous impacts on the ecosystem when bison are back there.
So I think, I'm not sure if there's more. There was another question about how soon in receiving bison or buffalo do you have to worry about inbreeding?
Excellent question, and right away. Banff is a good example. We reintroduced 16 animals, very small herd to that population, but every animal there was 6 males and 10 bred females, and every animal was intensely investigated for its DNA, proving that none of those animals were related to each other. And the number of bulls in a naturally managed population where they're 50-50 roughly, sort of guaranteed that the fetuses those cows were carrying would be unrelated to each other. That population is now well over 100, and there's no concerns yet in breeding. But typically on a bison ranch or a privately owned property, there's 1 bull to roughly 20-25 cows in a commercial operation. That bull has to get replaced before he has the chance to breed his mothers and daughters. And typically that's once every 3 to 4 years as a way to mitigate inbreeding. The other alternative is to manage a high density of males, almost a 50-50 ratio, so that the males themselves limit the amount of inbreeding that takes place. In almost every population that's been examined for paternity, the average bull only breeds 3 cows through the course of a summer, regardless of how many bulls there are in that population. They spend so much, plains bison in particular, spend so much time courting, they don't actually do a lot of loving. So it takes a large number of bulls in a population like that to breed every female that comes along.
There are a lot of questions around. So another question was, are there grants available for someone wanting to get involved in bison reintroduction?
A lot of bison reintroductions are funded by grants, but I can't answer the question specifically as to whether an individual can do that. Most of these are done through governments, the state of Alaska, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Do you notice? I think we touched on the population and genetic diversity. How can one get a hold of natural prairie grass seeds to bring the land back to natural prairie grasses from farmland? So cultivated to farm.
That's just a simple Google search. There are organizations in Saskatchewan, for example, that are actively producing and selling native plant species to the general public or to organizations like Grasslands. Grasslands has a program. It's self-contained. They don't sell the seed, but they harvest the seed across the park and then send it to organizations where they'll grow those seeds out, and they get a portion of the seeds back for their reclamation purposes. And then a grass seed producer has some to sell and maintain their business opportunities. But just if a simple Google search of native seed producers will yield the answer to where it's closest to you for those seeds.
I think this question kind of comes up a lot as well, because a lot of the lands that are formerly a bison range are now grazed by cattle. And so the question is can you, or how much of the web that is described in your presentation is supported by cattle, or like what is the carryover between the two?
Well, there's only 2% of native grasslands remaining in their historical condition left in North America, the most rapidly declining ecosystem on the continent. And if you step back in time to that period when bison were extirpated from the landscape, shortly thereafter, cattle began to replace bison. And they, in many ways, were surrogates for bison. The late 1800s, early 1900s, those long cattle drives from Texas north into southern Canada, for example, those cattle acted in many ways similar to bison. The two things they didn't do were shed hair that was valuable, and they didn't create the wallow systems that bison create. But otherwise, on that vast landscape, ranches like the Turkey Track Ranch that straddled the Canada-US border in Montana and Saskatchewan was tens of thousands of square miles in size, and those cattle were left on the landscape year-round. They weren't brought home to central feed yards, for example. So they acted like bison. The winters of 1896-97 was a severe one that literally killed millions of cattle across the northern Great Plains. Large ranches were forced to break up and become smaller ranches. Those smaller ranchers then brought in more cattle, and everything was good until the winter of 1906-07, when another devastating blizzard wiped out virtually every cow on the northern plains. And that caused a switch in grazing behavior or the management practices of cattle producers. It ended the era of free-range grazing and forced producers to bring their cattle home during the winter months and feed them. So the landscape was vacant of large herbivores, dung pat forming animals on the landscape through the winter months, right through until early spring. And that's the case today. Throughout most of North America, if there's a winter, there are no cattle on that landscape. So that terminated that part of the relationship with bison.
There is some questions here, and I'm going to I think that they're connected. So there's a question around mingling wild bison with domesticated bison, but also wood and plains bison. So what would happen if you started to mix the genetics there?
There's very little mingling between wild and commercial bison, typically because the wild ones are established in places where there aren't cattle, so there's very little mixing that way. Mixing of plains and wood bison, however, is a really dominant thing in the industry these days. Elk Island National Park manages both plains and wood bison. Plains bison entered the commercial industry in late 60s, early 70s as a livestock species in Canada. Wood bison were still considered endangered right up until the early 1990s when they were down-listed to threatened. And at that point, the doors opened for wood bison to enter the Canadian bison ranching industry. They were so valuable that the producers who bought them maintained them as purebred wood bison. But it didn't take very long before they decided, well, I've got a herd of 100 plains bison cows. I can buy 6 wood bison bulls, and then I can create a hybrid, under the assumption that wood bison are a third larger than plains bison, but in particular, they have a longer back. And the longer the back is, the more tenderloin there is. So they get higher proportion of high-valued meats off of that hybrid cross buffalo. It's to the point now where there's 400,000 plains bison in North America, between 400,000 and 500, probably closer to 500,000 now. But there's only 20,000 animals in conservation herds, publicly managed populations. Of those 93% that are in the commercial industry, I would estimate now in Canada that 90% of them are cross plains and wood bison, and they can no longer contribute to bison conservation for pure plains or pure woods. You can't go backwards in time. So there's a major impact now of having crossbred bison on ranch lands. It doesn't affect the number of animals on conservation herds, but it's definitely perhaps a topic of concern for the future should something happen to these publicly managed herds.
Yeah, I think this is a really common question. I think you touched on it just a little bit, but given the low size of population at its minimum, is there any issue with genetic diversity in the community?
Excellent question. I went back through the historic literature trying to figure out actually how many animals were left at the end of the extirpation of plains bison. And from everything I can figure out, including the 23 that were in Yellowstone National Park, there were animals on zoos and on private ranches. But all of those bison were gathered from small populations scattered across the continental United States. The core foundation population for all living plains bison today is 119 animals. It's remarkable that there hasn't been a major decrease in genetic diversity. There are several university labs looking at the DNA of bison historically, comparing it to modern day bison. And it looks like because those bison were captured from right across the continental United States and a few in Canada, that they captured enough genetic diversity in those 119 animals to ensure that the majority of what once was there is still there. And now that's a major topic of concern for publicly managed bison populations. There's roughly 63 publicly owned herds in North America, and each one of them is concerned about long-term genetic diversity. The geneticists say that you have to start, for many years, it was 400 animals I would ensure that you had 90% of the genetics that you started with in 500 years' time. They've increased that now to 1,000 head base to ensure that we don't lose. We'll always lose genetic diversity in captive populations, but not so much that there's a risk.
So the question is, are there any native plant species that we can seed on the land that will support bison wanting to frequent there and support their herd family nourishing? Any good plants that are symbiotic? Is it just native grasses, or what is the most effective? Which one is the easiest to grow and spread?
Yeah, almost all native grasses are superb forage for bison. It doesn't matter where you are. If you're in the southwestern U.S., completely different suite of grass species there compared to northern Alberta, for example. So I can't give you specifics. In Grasslands National Park, is blue grama grass, needle grasses, wheat grasses. The dominant native species are the ones that bison tend to seek out. But throughout their historic range, their preferred winter food, if there's winter on the landscape, not like Texas, for example, are sedges, and in particular, Carex aquatilis and Carex atherodes. Those two sedge plants are what drove the winter migrations of bison historically. There's lots of accounts of bison, going back to the 1800s, people saying that they migrated from central Wyoming to central Saskatchewan and back again every year. There's massive north-south migration between summer and winter ranges. And most people don't think that actually happened. There was a dispersal from the open summer ranges to areas that were protected during the winter months, but it wasn't a forested environment that they sought out because of environmental protection. It's the seeking out of sedges in low-lying wet areas that drove bison to move to those places. Because the unique thing about sedges compared to grasses is that the sedge has a triangular shaped stem that is very stiff. The leaves are very stiff, and they hold the fallen snow up in a very soft loft that raises it up and keeps it fairly deep, but it doesn't become dense and compacted. That creates a very insulated snowpack such that there's always fresh shoots of green sedge growing at the soil snow interface. And that's what the bison were historically selecting for. So if you have a wetland that's been perhaps plowed under at some point and reseeded into a crop, sedges are the plants that you should plant on your property to help bison thrive through the winter months.
Did you notice if any of the different landscapes have an effect on the bison's behavior and or other bison relationships?
That's a good question. There's a rule that was developed in the 1800s by a German biologist. I forget his first name, but it's a common rule in science now called Bergmann's rule. And he postulated that all mammals, regardless of species, get larger as you go from the equator towards northern latitudes, including people. Scandinavians are larger than Southern African people, for example. And that's true with bison. The bison that are native to Texas are smaller than the ones that are native to Montana, and they're smaller than the ones that are native to Wood Buffalo National Park, for example. And it's a relationship between the surface area of the bison and its body mass. The larger that relationship, the better the animals can survive extreme temperature changes, for example, until you reach 66 degrees latitude, and then they begin to decrease. Animals become smaller as an adaptation to low light and forage and all that stuff. So there's difference on a continental scale in the size and behavior of bison based upon the latitude that they live at. And as they move through those different ecosystems, plains bison and wood bison, for example, have very different behaviors, so different that they're remarkable. Plains bison lived in those massive rutting aggregations during the summer months of tens of thousands. And every time a male met another potential rival during the breeding season, they had to outcompete that male for right to breed. So they're constantly meeting strangers and having to prove themselves. And as a result, they're far more aggressive to each other, have a higher mortality rate than wood bison do. Because wood bison evolved in the northern boreal forests, small meadow systems within much larger forested ecosystems. And it's very likely that every bull knew their rivals because herds were small and they didn't travel great distances through unoccupied forests to encounter another rival male. So they had already established the social dominance pecking order that a plains bison never did until the breeding season came along. So the battles are less intense, their vocalizations are less intense, and their courtship behaviors towards receptive females are more personal and intimate than they are with a plains bison who's just a big bully trying to get the job done. There's tremendous differences between subspecies based upon where they lived. I'm not sure if that answered the question or not.
Yeah, I was also I was also just thinking about you and all of teachings and the wealth of knowledge that you have already shared, and want to just check in with your energy. There's about 4 more questions left. Do you want me to just pick a couple and then yeah,
I
okay.
don't know how long people want to linger, but
Yeah.
I do have another meeting to go to shortly, so I'll take 2
Okay.
more.
2 more? Okay. So one is just around, let me see. Okay, so we are an Indigenous women's bison caretakers of the Southern Plains bison in Texas. What are key suggestions for our reconnecting with land in the Southern Plains? What is it that the largest producers are missing that we can be more effective on?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure if I can answer that intelligently. If you're from a tribe in the States, that in Texas in particular, that has the land base that don't currently have bison, I would go talk to the superintendent in Caprock Canyon State Park and pester the heck out of him to try to get bison that are adapted to that landscape. They've always been there, and bring them to your reserve and get them established. You can bring bison from northern herds south into Texas, but they might not do that well simply because of the differences in temperature. There's a prof at the University of Nebraska who's shown that as global warming progresses, bison will, and they always have, gotten smaller as the temperature increases. And that's going to be a trend in the future. So the ones in Caprock Canyons and other places in Texas are supremely adapted to that, whereas the northern one might struggle to survive just because of the heat and humidity. And then if you do bring them to a reserve, do your very best to connect your people with the culture that they once had with bison. I do a lot of work with First Nations here in Canada, and that's sometimes the biggest stumbling block is to get the people to want to re-engage with their cultures. Because they've been away from bison for so long that sometimes they've lost those ceremonies and cultural linkages that they once had.
Yeah, the question was coming from Lucille Contreras, who is, I think she's the both South signatories to the Buffalo Treaty, and actually will be coming up for a visit with you in May. So
Cool.
and so they have some buffalo that they've introduced to the land down there in Texas. I was just there last week or so, but yeah, they were just kind of like looking for suggestions, as you're introducing them and things that you would need to consider. So she'll have an opportunity to hopefully ask you in person
I
as
look forward to
well.
that.
Yeah. And then just last question was, have you been involved in bison collar research? And if so, what metrics have you measured with the collars?
Yeah, bison collars are a difficult thing. If you're trying to put them on males, males destroy them. It's difficult to keep a collar on an adult breeding age male. There's research taking place in Elk Island right now where they're trying to develop one that's indestructible. It's built out of Kevlar and all kinds of really strong materials. It is the head-to-head battling that bison bulls do during the breeding season that tends to destroy them. In Alaska, we put 130 radio collars on wood bison before they were released, and those animals ranged from calves through to big old bulls. On the ones that were still growing, you have to put on a collar that will adapt to the change in size of the neck as the animal increases in size. So we put on a latex, very flexible, stretchy collar on those young animals so that they wouldn't choke as they got bigger. Well, it turns out that was a mistake because they were so stretchy that they just hook it on a tree and leave it dangling there as they went on their way. Very low retention rates. So you do have to be very careful on the measurements that you take of the neck circumference of the bison in relation to its age. Make sure that it is still tight enough to stay on, but not so tight that it will restrict movement. And then you can build into the collars a little device that blows that collar apart after a predetermined length of time. Once a year, for example, you'd have to replace the collar as it becomes disconnected.
And just one final thing, because I'm really curious as well. Does chronic wasting disease impact the bison?
No, that's a cervid disease.
Yeah.
Mad cow disease does because it's a brain disease that can affect bovines. An example of that was during the early 2000s when we took those first bison into Siberia. We wanted to land in Anchorage and refuel this massive Russian cargo plane, but we were refused the right to land because we were carrying bovids during a period of mad cow disease. So that certainly can be a concern, but not the cervid diseases.
Well, thank you, Wes. Oh my goodness, I feel like probably all of us are going to spend the rest of our day trying to absorb all of the things that you've talked about. And I highly recommend listening again and again and again, because you keep picking up new things as you walk your own land and you build your own relationships with the land. Then you open your eyes to things that maybe you didn't see or notice before. And so I encourage everyone to go out and do that and walk more on the land. And thank you, Wes, again, for being so generous with your knowledge. I believe that this is going to be recorded and posted on the website. So those who want to watch it again and again and again and again, it will be there for you. So thank you, everyone, for coming today and for listening. I don't know if you have any closing words, Adrian or Teresa.
No,
No.
well, just thank you for the opportunity. I'm always happy to share my accumulated little bits of knowledge. And like you just said, I do highly encourage people who have bison on their landscapes now, whether you're a private producer or a First Nation, to just sit quietly on the grassland with the animals at a safe distance, of course. Just soak in what they're doing. Every time after 40 years, my wife and I visit a bison property, whether it's a conservation or privately owned animals, we learn something new. And we're constantly trying to pass on that new knowledge through venues like this. And I guarantee that if you spend time on the landscape with your animals, you too will pick up some things that you'd never occurred to you before, if you take the time to really sit and listen and watch to see what's happening.